Welcome to this session on IT users and roles. In this session, we'd like to discuss the different types of infrastructure roles that are there by default and how the role-based access control works. It has control over application permissions as well as infrastructure permissions. And then we'll look at how to create infrastructure users. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we think about infrastructure security, Lifetime will be the tool that's providing the centralized user management framework that we can use. This will allow it to create the IT users and roles for all of the environments in the infrastructure. So once you've logged into Lifetime, you'll see an area called User Management, where we'll be able to manage users, teams, roles, different authentication modes, and service accounts. In this session, we're going to focus on the users and the roles. So if we think about setting up an access control policy, this is going to be managed through roles. And we can define different permissions for each environment of the infrastructure. So here, the different roles that are built in by default are developer and administrator. And then we might create some other role like operator. When we look at something like the development role, we can see whether or not they have any infrastructure permissions to actually work with the servers and Lifetime itself, and then each of the other environments. So a developer inside of the development environment can reuse and monitor different applications. In quality, they can only list them, and in production, they have no access. Where an administrator has infrastructure permissions to actually manage the servers and the systems themselves, as well as control over each of the different environments. So if we wanted to, we could create our own role, which we'll use as an example throughout this session, like the operator role. And we might be able to give them some infrastructure permissions, and then do something like the operator can reuse and monitor applications, but then can change and deploy them inside of quality and production. So let's look at some of this in a little more detail. So if we have a role defined, we can edit that role. And when we go to define the access that the role has, what will come up is each of the different environments. So here we can see the development, quality, and production environments. And this is where the operator's settings started with that we just looked at in the last slide. They had reuse and monitor access in development, they had change and deploy in quality, and they had change and deploy in production. So when we create a new role, there are a number of different types of access permissions that can be granted, and then however many environments we have, all of those environments will show up, and we can choose some level of access to applications inside of those environments. So the application access permission is no access, which means that that particular user won't have any access to the applications in that environment. A listing, where they can just see the information about which applications exist. Reuse and monitor, where they can actually open, debug, and reuse the functionality that's there, or they can monitor the functionality that's there, but they wouldn't be able to change things or modify them. And then change and deploy. This level of access gives the user permission to reuse and change or create brand new ones, as well as deploy them inside of that environment. And then there's full control, where the user would be able to change, deploy, and manage any of the environment settings for that application so that they have full control over it. Now there are a different set of permissions called the infrastructure permissions. So Lifetime allows certain roles to have infrastructure permissions to actually manage users and roles across the environments and manage teams and applications. And this will give them these types of permissions across all of the environments. So here we can see the operator. When we look at its infrastructure permissions, they are not allowed to manage users or roles, but they are allowed to manage teams and those teams' application roles. So here they've been granted some of the infrastructure permissions, but obviously not all. Now, when we go to create new users, we'll create those users in Lifetime, and once we create them in Lifetime, those users exist across all of the environments. By default, a user will have a role, and then we can add application-specific permissions, as well as add them to different teams. So here you can see we could create a brand new user, our friend Jim Matthews. We have to give him a role, so we'll give him the operator role that we've been looking at. He'll have a username, a password, and we can add some sort of email. One thing that's important to note here is that when we add new users to Lifetime, these are IT users that can access the environments and access the applications. These are not application end users. Application end users would be registered inside of the user's application that's installed as part of the OutSystems infrastructure. Or we may have an external registry of users for the applications. So Lifetime's users and those IT users are not the application or end users. And when we actually come in to view a particular user, here we can see that Jim Matthews is an operator by default. And then we can see the application roles that he has been granted. So for all of the applications, he's only using his default role, which is the operator role. Here we can see his infrastructure permission to be able to manage teams. And again, because he's an operator, he gets reuse and monitor, change and deploy, and change and deploy in production. So what this does mean is that inside of all applications, he's using his default role. We could also create other types of roles and then grant him access to certain applications with those other roles. We can do that by granting roles in applications. So in this session, we've tried to give you a good overview of how IT users and roles help us manage the different environments inside of our infrastructure and how users can access those environments. So thanks for watching. Have a great day.